From the 1940s through to the 1980s, the San Diego-based Pacific Southwest Airlines could be seen as the de facto flag carrier of California. With its sunset-colored livery and cheerfully smiling planes, PSA aircraft were a popular sight up and down the west coast of the United States, and it was actually their operating model that ended up being the inspiration for the current giant, Southwest Airlines. But September of 1978 was a time of change for PSA, as the company prepared for the imminent deregulation of the aviation industry, something that would eventually lead to the company's bankruptcy. But of course, no one knew that at the time. Early in the morning of the 25th of September that year, a PSA flight crew arrived at the gate in Sacramento, ready to fly their big orange and white Boeing 727 down to San Diego, with a quick stop in Los Angeles in the middle. In command was a 42-year-old captain who had been flying for PSA for 17 years at that point, and during that time he had accumulated over 14,300 hours, including a very impressive 10,482 hours on the 727. The first officer was also experienced, with a total of 10,000 hours, including 5,800 on the 727 during his 9 years at PSA. And the flight crew also included a flight engineer, who had worked for PSA for 11 years and had 10,800 hours of experience, including over 6,500 on the 727. So these were no beginners. Instead, they would have likely formed one of the most experienced crews around at the time. As the passengers started boarding, the pilots carried out all of the normal pre-flight checks and examined the dispatch paperwork. And that showed that their 10-year-old plane was in good working order and that the weather at their destinations was excellent. A perfect, cloudless Southern Californian day and a great day to be a pilot. The rest of the setup was then completely routine, followed by a normal takeoff from Sacramento and a very pleasant flight down towards Los Angeles. So at around 8 o'clock in the morning, the flight landed at LAX, where some passengers then disembarked and others boarded for the next leg down towards San Diego. The manifest for this flight included 4 flight attendants and 128 passengers, but 29 of those were actually PSA employees, making this flight a real company party. So with a total of 135 passengers and crew on board, the pilots then taxied out their gleaming Boeing 727 from the gate for the second time that day, and were then back in the air again by the time 08:34. Los Angeles International Airport and what was then San Diego's Lindbergh Field are only about 100 nautical miles apart, so the flight was expected to take little more than half an hour, even after maneuvering through the crowded airspace around the two airports. Today, both LAX and San Diego International Airport, as it's now called, form part of the enormous Southern California TRACON, a unified approach control center that handles aircraft all the way from the upper flight levels and then funnels them down onto the region's many different airports. But back in 1978, air traffic control at the lower levels in the San Diego area was instead handled by the San Diego Approach Control Facility at Miramar Naval Air Station. And they enforced a newly created Terminal Radar Service Area, or TRSA, centered on Lindbergh Field. Within that TRSA, which stretched from 4,000 up to 8,000 feet, air traffic controllers provided radar vectoring and approach sequencing for all traffic under instrument flight rules, which obviously included all airliners, but it also included participating VFR, or traffic operating under visual flight rules. Underneath the TRSA, each individual airport then had, and actually still has, its own local control area. But back in 1978, the boundaries between them weren't very well defined. For example, Lindbergh Tower's area of responsibility overlapped with the area for Montgomery Field, a control tower-equipped general aviation airport located less than 6 nautical miles to the north of Lindbergh. On top of those little discrepancies, handoffs between San Diego Approach and the various towers were also quite poorly standardized. And that was probably because the TRSA was so new, that the handoffs didn't always occur right at the 4,000 feet boundary of the TRSA, which is worth remembering here. Anyway, this story really begins at the time 0856, when the pilots of PSA Flight 182 were descending towards 7,000 feet inside of the San Diego TRSA. The first officer was acting as pilot flying on this leg, while the captain was pilot monitoring, and the flight engineer was at this time talking to the PSA operations controllers to prepare them for the flight's arrival. On top of the 3 active pilots, there was also an off-duty PSA pilot sitting on the jump seat, and he was chatting with the captain about non-operational topics like contracts and insurance as the descent continued. Now today, it's forbidden for us pilots to have off-topic conversations below 10,000 feet, and sometimes even from higher than that, because of the sterile cockpit rule. But that rule didn't exist yet back in 1978. Now, handling the radios should be the job of the pilot monitoring. In this case, that would have been the captain, but the cockpit voice recorded transcripts shows that it was the first officer who was the one making most of the radio calls, even though he was also flying the plane. Anyway, at time 0857, the first officer reported that he had the airport in sight, which still today is a common way for pilots to request a visual approach, meaning an often tighter approach flown using visual cues instead of instruments. And when he heard that, the controller therefore promptly cleared the flight for the visual approach into runway 27 at Lindbergh Field. Now the airport only had one runway, 0927, of which only runway 09 was equipped with an instrument landing system, and runway 27 actually only allows visual approaches to this day due to the presence of terrain and buildings very close to its arrival end. Fortunately though, as I've mentioned earlier, the visibility on this day was virtually unlimited, so the pilots would have been expecting a straightforward visual approach, one that they had likely done many times before. And when we're talking about expectations, I'm guessing that you would never board an aircraft without knowing that everyone have first gone through a proper security screening, right? And still, almost every one of us every day happily roam around on the internet without any real protection of our personal data. Right now, companies known as data brokers are legally harvesting and selling your information, which include things like your phone numbers, family details and social security number. That's information that can then be used to generate spam calls, phishing scams and even identity theft attempts. But this is where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Instead of you having to track down hundreds of these brokers individually, Incogni will do all of that for you, and they will then systematically reach out to them and force them to delete your information. But what I appreciate the most is that they don't just do this once. No, they will continuously monitor for absolute compliance and make sure that your data then doesn't reappear somewhere else as long as you stay with them. When I signed up, I was actually shocked to discover that my data was being sold by over 150 different companies. And Incogni are now removing it all, which has already reduced my spam emails and robocalls a lot. Right now, you can also do this and get 60% off Incogni's annual plan if you scan this QR code, click on the link here below or go to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT at checkout. Thank you Incogni for supporting what we do. Now let's get back to the story. Now since Flight 182 was coming from the northwest, they would eventually need to turn left onto a downwind leg, then fly out beyond the airport boundaries before turning right onto a base leg, and then right again onto the final, something that we refer to as a standard traffic pattern. So that's what the pilots were now also planning for. For a few minutes, the cockpit voice recorder continued to capture the ongoing conversations between the captain and the jump seater, as well as between the flight engineer and operations, with essentially no comment coming from the first officer. That only changed at time 0859 when the pilots paused their conversations to complete the approach checklist. Right as that was done, the San Diego approach controller called the flight up with what's known as a traffic advisory. Traffic, 12 o'clock, 1 mile, northbound. The captain replied that they were looking, and the controller then added that there was additional traffic also at 12 o'clock, 3 miles, just north of the field, northeastbound. A Cessna 172 climbing VFR out of 1,400 feet. Now, events were about to escalate rapidly, so let's pause here for a while and talk a little bit about what the controller was doing here. You see, when two aircraft operating in radar-controlled airspace comes within a certain distance of each other or are likely to cross paths, air traffic controllers issue traffic advisories in order to enhance the pilot's spatial awareness of these potential threats. It's quite normal to get a bunch of traffic advisories when descending through busy terminal airspace, especially if there are multiple airports nearby or if the area has a lot of light aircraft flying visually. When a controller formulates a traffic advisory, they're supposed to include the traffic's location, heading, altitude, then aircraft type if available, and the pilots should then report whether they have the reported traffic in sight. If they don't, well, then what happened next will depend a little bit on what time period we're talking about. Today, when under radar control, these advisories are mainly for awareness first and separation second, with only some exceptions. But in the United States back in 1978, it was very common for controllers to respond to a call of traffic in sight by the pilots by giving a follow-up instruction to maintain visual or own separation. That meant, and still does actually, that the pilots would now be responsible for keeping the traffic in sight and ensuring that they wouldn't get too close to it. Something that we somewhat already have to do when we're flying in visual conditions anyway, since we're always expected to exercise vigilance regardless. This principle of seeing and avoiding traffic underpins all forms of separation, but it often, by itself, doesn't provide adequate assurance against collisions, since human vision and perception is far from perfect. We might, for example, lose sight of the traffic, or it might be in a place that we can't see it, or we just miss it for whatever reason. That's one of the reasons why air traffic controllers have radar, to provide redundancy for us poor pilots peering out of our cockpits. But at the time of this story, there was still quite some uncertainty about exactly how much backup the radar controllers were required to give. They were, for example, allowed to instruct the aircraft to maintain visual separation from each other if at least one of those aircraft reported that it had the other aircraft in sight. And that often tended to be the overtaking aircraft, since it's generally hard to see what's behind you. Legally, that own separation clearance then absolved the controller of responsibility for the separation between those two aircraft, unless the pilots of the overtaking aircraft reported that they had lost sight of the traffic. Visual separation rules were based on the principle of right of way, which held the overtaking aircraft responsible for avoiding the other traffic. So, if a collision were to occur, well, then the overtaking crew would therefore usually be found at fault. But those rules had been written at a time before the development of jet airliners, so they therefore didn't take into account their needs at all. In fact, the right-of-way concept placed the burden of separation on the aircraft that in this case was less maneuverable and more demanding to fly, which of course didn't make much sense if the goal was to ensure separation by the most effective means. But the result of this was that the controllers could simply tell the pilots of an airliner to maintain visual separation from a light aircraft, and it was then up to the jet pilots to decide how to best do that and what the margin of separation should actually be. And that was all without the benefit of modern traffic collision avoidance systems or moving traffic displays, and of course without automatic conflict resolution advisories from those systems. Now, it's also important to know that even when they were cleared for visual separation, pilots generally assumed that the controllers were still monitoring them on the radar if the radar was available, which I think was a pretty reasonable assumption to make. And studies later showed that because of this assumption, pilots tended to relax their traffic scan a bit under radar control. But at the same time, the controllers tended to also relax their vigilance after a visual separation clearance had been given, meaning that basically no one was paying full attention. So I guess you can see the problem here. This practice put airliner crews into a see and avoid situation in an airspace where redundant ATC-based separation was possible, but suddenly not fully utilized. Now, before we continue, I also want to talk about the aircraft that was pointed out in that traffic advisory for PSA Flight 182. This was a single-engine Cessna 172 belonging to Gibbs Flight Center, a flight school based out of Montgomery Field. Remember, that was the general aviation airport that I mentioned earlier. It was being flown by a 35-year-old commercial pilot with about 400 hours who was training for his instrument rating, which would eventually allow him to fly under instrument flight rules in poor visibility. But because the visibility on this day was unlimited, he was wearing a training hood designed to block his view of everything except for the instruments ahead of him. Now, this is something everyone who has gone through instrument training will surely recognize. It's not a great user experience, but it is highly effective. In any case, on this day he was being supervised by a 32-year-old instructor who had about 5,100 hours and had been working as an instructor for about a year. The pair had just flown 2 practice approaches, ending in touch and goes on runway 09 at Lindbergh Field, which, if you paid attention, was against the direction of the landing traffic. Now, that sounds absolutely crazy today, since San Diego International is now the busiest single runway airport in the United States. So any aircraft that would hope to do touch and goes against the prevailing traffic direction would now have to wait for hours, if it would even be possible. But I guess it was just a different world back then. Anyway, at time 08:57, the Cessna pilots had ended their second practice approach and broken off their training session in order to return towards Montgomery Field, and they were now climbing out towards the northeast. After reporting their position, Lindbergh Tower had handed them over to San Diego approach control, and at time 08:59, the pilots told the approach controller that they were heading northeast, climbing through 1,500 feet. The approach controller then acknowledged radar contact and instructed the Cessna to maintain visual flight rules at or below 3,500 feet, and also, and this is important, to maintain a heading of 070 degrees. Now, the odd thing here was that an aircraft at that altitude would never enter the TRSA, which started at 4,000 feet, remember? So, under modern air traffic control rules, they wouldn't be under the jurisdiction of approach control at all, unless a standardized handoff altitude below 3,500 feet had been established. One of the NTSB board members later called this fact undesirable, but no one could explain why this was even allowed to happen, which makes me think that it probably wasn't that unusual at all at the time. At this point, it wasn't yet a problem though, since the approach controller was still talking to both the Cessna and Flight 182, so when he saw that the 2 aircraft would eventually cross paths, he just gave the 727 that traffic advisory that I mentioned earlier. A few seconds later, the first officer also spotted an aircraft dead ahead and said to his colleagues, "Okay, we've got that other 12. Just to be on the safe side, the approach controller then reiterated the traffic advisory a few moments later, pointing out that the aircraft in question was still at their 12 o'clock position 3 miles out, now climbing out of 1,700 feet. Now, 12 o'clock refers to a model we use in aviation to explain the relevant position of things, where 12 is straight ahead and 3 o'clock is out to our right, and so on. In the cockpit, the first officer now quickly announced, "Got him!" and the captain then reported, "Traffic in sight." And once the approach controller heard that, he instructed Flight 182 to maintain visual separation from the Cessna and to also contact Lindbergh Tower for their landing clearance, which the captain acknowledged, and which also meant that the 2 aircraft would now be on 2 different radio frequencies. Now, I probably wouldn't accept visual separation from a VFR aircraft below me in these circumstances unless it was flying a very known pattern, but that's just my personal opinion. There are certainly pilots out there who would, and back then this was likely the norm. Anyway, Flight 182 now switched over their radios to the Lindbergh Tower frequency and began a left turn onto the downwind leg, which would have been a heading of around 090 degrees or so, whilst also descending out of 3,200 feet. Now, the area of the downwind leg was within that unclarified overlap area between the Lindbergh and Montgomery towers that I mentioned before, and according to San Diego Approach Control's facility order, the controllers weren't supposed to clear Lindbergh-bound traffic to fly below the 4,000 feet floor of the TRSA while overhead Montgomery airspace, which included the area of overlap with Lindbergh airspace, unless they had coordinated with Montgomery Tower first. However, the staff at San Diego Approach stated that they divided the overlapping area down the middle, with the area south of that line considered to be under control of Lindbergh Tower and the area north of the line under control of Montgomery, even though no formal letter of agreement about this actually existed. Now, the purpose of keeping aircraft above 4,000 feet in that area was to ensure separation between aircraft approaching Lindbergh Field an aircraft in the Montgomery traffic pattern, which technically didn't yet include that Cessna from Gibbs Flight School, but only because it hadn't contacted Montgomery Tower yet. Despite this, San Diego Approach cleared Flight 182 onto the visual approach without any altitude limitations, and therefore also through Montgomery's airspace below 4,000 feet, but that's likely something that they did every day. This, however, meant that the airliner would now proceed into the airspace where the Cessna was already located. If that rule of 4,000 feet would have been followed, well then everything that I'm about to tell you could have been avoided. But it wasn't. As the pilots of Flight 182 were now preparing for the visual approach, whilst also looking for the traffic, the approach controller contacted the Cessna and reported that there was a PSA Boeing 727 at his 6 o'clock position, meaning behind him, traveling eastbound, and that its pilots had them in sight. The Cessna pilot acknowledged this transmission to him, but legally they didn't need to take any action because the overtaking aircraft was maintaining visual separation from them. Like I mentioned earlier, the Cessna and Flight 182 were now also talking to two different controllers, even though they were both in the same airspace, something that would likely never happen today. On board Flight 182, the pilots now started configuring the aircraft for landing by selecting flaps 2 and then flaps 5. During a visual approach, it's very important to keep the landing field in sight so that the first officer, who was the one who had actually stated that he had the Cessna in sight, was now also the one looking at the field, assessing how to maneuver his aircraft for the approach. Shortly after Flight 182 had initiated contact with Lindbergh Tower, the tower controller advised them, "Traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, a Cessna." But during the 20 seconds that had passed since the previous traffic advisory, it seems like the pilots had now lost sight of the Cessna due to a number of different factors. First of all, the CVR transcript shows, like I mentioned, that the first officer was the one who initially had seen the traffic, but he was also the pilot flying and he was talking on the radio quite a lot as well. So it is doubtful that he would have had the extra capacity to also keep tabs on traffic out of the window while he was looking at the airfield. Now, the flight engineer was theoretically supposed to help scan for traffic here, but he had been late getting started on his pre-landing duties and was therefore still talking to operations. And to be perfectly honest, I doubt that he would have been able to see much from his position anyway, given that he sat behind the two pilots and the Cessna was located below them. The second reason why they might have lost the Cessna was because just seconds before the tower controller's last traffic advisory, the Cessna had made a right turn from heading 070 to 090 degrees without permission. Now, the approach controller had told them to maintain heading 070, so they were obligated to report if they wanted to make a turn, but that for some reason had not happened. Without a cockpit voice recorder on the Cessna, we will never know why the pilot suddenly changed course and why the instructor didn't correct the mistake or inform air traffic control. But this unauthorized turn now meant that the Cessna had started flying due east, the same direction as Flight 182, but of course much slower. Which also meant that the 727 was now rapidly catching up with them from behind whilst descending. This also meant that the Cessna would have been virtually stationary in the pilot's windscreens, making the small white silhouette almost impossible to make out against the backdrop of houses and urban neighborhoods below. When we pilots scan for traffic, we do so by dividing the windscreens up in sections and then scanning each section in turn to try and make out anti-collision lights or relative movement. But in a case like this, that wouldn't have helped much at all, because it wasn't moving. And also, the rules for formulating a traffic advisory requires the controller to state the traffic's heading, which he didn't do in this case. So the 727 pilots wouldn't have known that they were now approaching the Cessna directly from above and behind on the same track. The fourth possible reason that they didn't see it had to do with how the pilots had configured their seats. You see, the 727 cockpit is designed with the assumption that the pilot's eyes will be at the so-called design eye height. And the cockpit therefore included a reference point to help pilots adjust their seats in order to get to that height. But many PSA pilots later testified that they preferred to position their seats slightly below and aft of the design eye reference point because it gave them a better view of the instruments under the glare shield, something that was later found to be unnecessary, but habits die slowly. Now, if the pilots on board Flight 182 had in fact set their seats below the design reference point, well then the Cessna could have disappeared below the level of their windscreen wipers, but we don't know if this actually was a factor here. In any case, the Cessna pilots wouldn't have had any chance to see the 727 since it was now coming in from a position directly behind them, and it could also be that the pilot that was flying could have been wearing his hood still. So all of these factors clearly show why the see and avoid technique for maintaining traffic separation is so fallible. There are just too many reasons you might not spot another plane or lose it even if it's right in front of you on a clear, cloudless day. After a few seconds spent unsuccessfully searching for the Cessna, the captain asked his colleagues, "Is that the one we're looking at?" And the first officer responded, "Yeah, but I don't see him now." The captain then reported to the tower controller, "Okay, we had it there a minute ago." And the controller replied, "Roger," to which the captain added, "I think he's passed off to our right." And here, a critical misunderstanding now developed, all because of one single syllable. You see, on the control tower tapes, it sounded like the captain said, "passing," while the cockpit voice recorder showed that he most probably said the word passed, as in the past tense. The Cessna hadn't passed off on their right. In fact, it was still directly in front of them, so he clearly had no idea where the Cessna was. But when the controller heard passing, he thought that this meant that the pilots were actually watching the Cessna as they overtook it. He also couldn't verify whether the two planes were maintaining adequate separation from each other because the radar screen in the tower wasn't capable of displaying any alphanumeric data or altitude readouts. So as far as he knew, the 727 pilots had the Cessna in sight, and that's where his responsibilities ended. But inside of the cockpit, the captain now said, "He was right over there a minute ago," showing that he was still searching for the Cessna and definitely couldn't see it. Moments later, the tower controller cleared Flight 182 to land, which was acknowledged, but the pilot's visual search for the Cessna still continued. At time 09, 01 and 11 seconds, the first officer asked, "Are we clear of that Cessna?" To which the flight engineer said, "Supposed to be." The captain said, "I guess," and the jump seater added, "I hope." The captain then exclaimed, "Oh yeah, before we turned downwind, I saw him about 1 o'clock, probably behind us now." But the Cessna had never been at his 1 o'clock position. Before turning downwind, it had been at his 11 o'clock position, so there was some later questions about whether he was referring to the same aircraft or whether he just misremembered the direction. This question was raised again a few seconds later when the first officer said, "There's one underneath," and then, "I was looking at that inbound there." At this moment, the only aircraft underneath them was the Cessna, which he couldn't see, and no other aircraft was inbound to any nearby airport at all at that time. The investigation later examined 16 different witness reports of a third aircraft in the vicinity of the 727 and the Cessna, but none of those reports lined up with each other, nor did the radar records show anything that would have been a third aircraft. So the NTSB report concluded that there wasn't a third aircraft, but one board member still dissented from that view on the grounds that a third aircraft was the best explanation for the flight crew's comments. But in any case, all we know is that whatever these pilots thought that they saw, it wasn't a Cessna. Meanwhile, in the approach control facility, a conflict alert now suddenly sounded as the computer predicted that Flight 182 and the Cessna would pass within 375 feet vertically and 1.2 nautical miles laterally within the next 40 seconds. Since the approach controller was still in contact with the Cessna, standard operating procedures actually required him to take action and try to resolve the conflict. But it turns out that this particular rule just wasn't really being followed that strictly. You see, the conflict alerting system had only been installed the month before, and since then it had generated about 13 alerts per day, most of which didn't require a resolution, because it was obvious to the controllers that no conflict existed. It was also common for alerts to be generated by aircraft that had each other in sight, because the pilot's judgment of a safe separation distance was often less than the alert criteria. In fact, some pilots testified that they would happily fly as close as half a mile from another aircraft as long as they could see them. That is crazy to me, because if I flew that close to another aircraft today, there would definitely be an investigation into how that was allowed to happen, and my TCAS would likely be screaming at full volume. But like I said, this was a different time. Anyway, all of this meant that the approach controller was now used to hearing this alert going off all the time, and the last message that he had heard from Flight 182 was that they had the Cessna in sight, so he just concluded that no action was needed. This, by the way, is a perfect example of why eliminating nuisance alerts is such an important part of the design of any warning system. Because as soon as people start disregarding a warning, it has stopped fulfilling its function. It is really as simple as that. Now, the final report initially accepted the argument by the controller that he wasn't required to do anything. But the dissenting NTSB board member again pointed out some real issues with that. First of all, the controller's assumption was based on the fact that the 727 crew had reported the Cessna in sight over a minute earlier, which is actually quite a long time in a situation like this. And the plane had also since then left his frequency, so he really had no way to be sure that they were still maintaining visual separation. Secondly, the fact that the planes were converging on his screen and that the conflict alert was going off meant that a conflict definitely existed, regardless of whether he thought that the crews were maintaining visual separation or not, and he was therefore required to resolve the conflict. That, hypothetically, could have been done by telling the Cessna to take evasive action or by calling the tower controller asking him to tell the 727 to turn, but because the culture surrounding the use of conflict alerting systems and radar in general predisposed him to not see the conflict as his problem, he ended up doing nothing. The controller later also claimed that he couldn't be sure that the conflict actually existed because the altitude blocks for the two aircraft were overlapping and couldn't be read, but the investigation showed that he could have separated those with just the press of a button. So overall, this situation was a failure of the San Diego approach control facility to adapt to the new capabilities and obligation brought about by advances in ATC technology. And although nobody understood it, that failure had now placed both the crew and passengers of Flight 182 and the Cessna crew in mortal danger. In the cockpit of Flight 182, the pilots had just lowered the landing gear when the captain suddenly screamed as he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. Seemingly from out of nowhere, the Cessna now emerged from below the window line and shot past the right side of the cockpit as the much faster 727 now overtook it from above and behind. The first officer had enough time for an instinct shout, but there was absolutely no time for evasive action. So at the time 09:01 and 47 seconds, the 727's right wing slammed into the back of the Cessna, tearing the single-engine plane into smithereens and instantly killing both pilots on board. Pieces of the Cessna then spiraled down from 2,600 feet, followed by several parts of the 727's right wing, including one of its Kruger flaps and a 30-foot section of the wing leading edge, which had been stripped bare all the way back to the forward spar. To make matters even worse, the Cessna's fuel tank had also now gotten lodged inside of the 727's wing and caught fire, streaming flames in the 727's wake as it struggled onwards. But due to the massive damage to the right wing's aerodynamics, it now quickly began to lose lift, while the left wing worked perfectly well, and that caused the airliner to start rolling into a steadily steepening right bank. The first officer tried to keep the plane under control by applying full left aileron, while the captain said, "Easy baby," and asked, "What have we got here?" trying to slow down the situation and get a sense of what was going on. The first officer just replied, "We're hit, man, we're hit," indicating the dire truth of what they were now facing. The captain jumped onto the radio and said, "Tower, we're going down, this is PSA." And the tower controller responded by promising to call out the equipment, meaning rescue vehicles and fire trucks. But no matter what the first officer now did, the plane just kept banking further and further to the right, even as he inputted full opposite aileron in the desperate attempt to try and regain control. With the steepening bank, the nose soon also started to drop, until Flight 182 was established in a graveyard spiral dive towards the densely populated neighborhoods below. Hundreds, if not thousands of people had heard the collision and was now looking up in time to see the 727 start spiraling down towards the Earth, with fire pouring out from its right-hand wing, until it finally disappeared behind the rooftops. In the last few seconds, the cockpit voice recorder captured the heartbreaking last words of the pilots as they realized that there was nothing that they could now do. And then, at time 09:02 and 4 seconds, in a 50-degree dive with 50 degrees of right bank, PSA Flight 182 slammed into an intersection in the North Park neighborhood of San Diego. Now, when an airliner crashes into a residential area, the results are unfortunately almost always horrific. Upon impact, a huge explosion engulfs the surrounding neighborhood, and burning pieces of wreckage was thrown for blocks, damaging or destroying 22 different buildings. In the end, all 135 people on board Flight 182 were killed, along with both occupants of the Cessna and 7 people on the ground. And that made this the worst air disaster to have ever occurred in the United States at the time. The NTSB initially ruled that the probable cause of the mid-air collision was the 727's pilot's failure to clearly inform air traffic control that they had lost sight of the Cessna, after previously accepting visual separation. And they listed the ATC procedures who failed to make use of the available equipment as a contributing factor. But like I already mentioned, one of the board members dissented, writing that the air traffic control procedures should be elevated to the probable cause of the accident instead. And that was because they had allowed the controllers to use a less effective method of separation when more effective methods were available. After the final report was published, the Airline Pilots Association also successfully appealed the findings, and in 1982 the NTSB amended the probable cause to accept the dissenting members' conclusions. This accident caused the FAA to start research into what would later become the modern Traffic Collision Avoidance System, TCAS, and the NTSB recommended that controllers should only allow visual separation in terminal areas if it was specifically requested by a pilot. But when my team and I were working on this story, we couldn't help but noticing some apparent similarities between this accident and the horrific January 2025 mid-air collision that happened in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. Preliminary reports suggest that in the DC collision, a controller granted a request for visual separation by a Black Hawk helicopter that was on crossing course with a CRJ 700. And although a conflict alert was reportedly generated in the control tower, radar ultimately wasn't used to avert the collision, possibly because the Black Hawk pilot had already reported that the CRJ was in sight. Now, the unique procedures in use at DC also may have made these kinds of conflicts a routine occurrence, just like it was at the San Diego Approach Control Center back in 1978. So, while we're obviously still waiting for the NTSB report to identify the full causes and contributing factors in that accident, it looks to us like there might still be some lessons to learn from the PSA Flight 182 accident. But you can be absolutely sure that the FAA, NTSB, and everyone involved in this new investigation will do everything in their power to get to the bottom of what happened and to use those lessons to make aviation even safer. Because that is what we do in this industry. We never stop learning from any accident, no matter how old or new they are, and that's also why we are creating these videos. Now, if you found this video interesting, we have a backbook with hundreds of other videos that I think that you might like, so check them out. And if you would like to support what my team and I are doing here, you can scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. That will also give you access to my next video before everyone else, which is pretty cool. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. And now I'm going home to eat cake because it's actually my birthday today.